Trump, even with his first administration, when he appointed Betsy DeVos, another white woman, who did not have the experience or qualifications, what he's actually doing is signaling to an era where white women, control education, because even still to this day, about 70% of educators are white women. And some of my favorite and greatest educators have been white women, so nothing against them or anything like that.
Sure.
But in America, there's this narrative and sort of myth of the schoolhouse and, the white woman there at the top.
Yeah.
You might have the white male principal or someone else. And Trump is signaling that we're returning to this era when he appoints a Secretary of Education with no experience in education to oversee or really dismantle and gut the department.
Hi, and welcome to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. I'm Dee.
And I'm Amir.
And we are here to share our thoughts on today's topics that affect Black and Brown communities nationwide and worldwide. Today, we're discussing the aftermath of Donald Trump's executive orders regarding education.
Yes. So the U.S. Department of Education, one of the most critical federal departments that oversees many things, has billions of dollars in different departments, literally may be eliminated, or there will be attempts to eliminate it. And we know, which we've seen through these trends of executive orders, overstepping the authority of the presidential branch, the executive branch, it would take acts of Congress to actually abolish the Department of Education.
Right.
But we're seeing different ways and different executive orders undermine what's happening in our schools nationwide.
Right. And I think the important thing here is that even though these executive orders don't go into effect immediately, it's jumpstarting these conversations for better and for worse about the need for the Department of Education. People think the Department of Education are the people who set the curriculum in schools.
Right.
They think that the federal government sets the curriculum, tells people what they need to study, and there's this sort of incorrect conversation happening that if you get rid of them, then schools will be able to set their own curriculum, and that they'll, not indoctrinate students by teaching them Black history, by teaching them about LGBT plus issues. And that's sort of the weird conversation that's happening right now. But really, I think the reason that Trump wants to remove the Department of Education is because the Department of Education actually controls the money that allows students who might not have access to education to have access to education. Exactly.
I mean, just in Title I funds alone, $18 billion in Title I funds to help low-income schools and students, $15 billion in special education for students who need accommodations and students with disabilities, which the federal government regulates that a lot now and oversees what districts are supposed to be doing and what schools are supposed to be doing. And this isn't education reform, it's education destruction.
Right.
Like you mentioned, the federal government doesn't actually set curriculum standards. School and school policy is done so much at the local level with your school board, and even down to your school level committees, you can influence what happens with the curriculum. But with this Trump executive orders, one of the Trump executive orders impacting education, where he said he's going to address what he's calling indoctrination happening in schools.
That's the buzzword right now.
That's the buzzword, as if schools are these places that are converting kids to radicalist, communist, trans people or different things, right?
Yeah.
Whereas you turn on the TV, you see our federal government is, spending billions on war and other things, and that has no impact on what people learn, but that's another thing. But schools are supposed to be a safe space where you can go. It's supposed to be that bootstrap they always talk about in America, where you can pick yourself up by your own bootstrap, even though we know that's a myth. But schools are not inclusive to all students. There's lots of bullying and harassment. Actually, millions of students are bullied and harassed every year. And I'm actually an education attorney and respond to some of these complaints where you hear about what's happening in schools. And unfortunately, we've seen with just the election of Trump, you see more bullying in schools happening. I just heard this weekend, was talking to some students about a fifth grader who was doing a Nazi salute. previously didn't know what a Nazi salute was, but guess what? You turn on the inauguration, it's being cheered on and applauded, right? So this is actually what's teaching students, and that's the true indoctrination that's
Right,
happening,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think people are going to say, well, if the Department of Education doesn't actually set the curriculum, why are we having this conversation? Well, if you take away the funding to schools, specifically the money earmarked in the Department of Education for students and schools that don't have a lot of resources, it puts the pressure on those who are making the decisions locally about what they're going to do.
Right.
Because if the government can say, if you take away these books from your classrooms, if you don't teach these courses, we'll give you more funding. You know, educators are caught between a rock and a hard place. They want their students to learn, but at what cost?
Right.
And so it's interesting because there's always been this campaign by Donald Trump, even before he was a president, for what they're calling school choice.
Right.
As in your choice to go to a public school versus a private school. And what's happening is the Department of Education funnels most of its money, if not all of its money, into public schools. There are a few rare exceptions, but by and large, most of the money goes to public schools. School choice says some of this money might be able to go to private schools.
Mm-hmm.
Private schools.
Faith-based schools, religious schools.
Yeah, they can be religious schools. They could be schools. You may see a MAGA school pop up. You may see, conservative schools pop up. What happens is if people go to these schools and the parents have control over the education at those schools, what happens is that's the indoctrination.
Exactly.
You're not learning what everyone else is learning, and so students are going to be on different footing. Students are going to have a different knowledge base, and knowledge has always been seen as the how to combat the isms, right? Racism, sexism, discrimination. A lot of people have seen education as the first step in the fight against that. Mm-hmm. Well, now we're seeing the dismantling of that first step.
Right. And his executive order attempting to privatize schools and encourage what they call school choice is definitely a part of that. His projected nominee for the Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, is also a person who has an agenda to privatize education based off her previous experience, and who is also, by the way, fully unqualified to be the Secretary of Education. She has next to no experience in education. And Trump, even with his first administration, when he appointed Betsy DeVos, another white woman who did not have the experience or qualifications, what he's actually doing is signaling to an era where white women, control education, because even still to this day, about 70% of educators are white women. And some of my favorite and greatest educators have been white women, so nothing against them or anything like that.
Sure.
But in America, there's this narrative and sort of myth of the schoolhouse and, the white woman there at the top.
Yeah.
You might have the white male principal or someone else. And Trump is signaling that we're returning to this era when he appoints a Secretary of Education with no experience in education to oversee or really dismantle and gut the department. Right. And I want to read a quote by Senator Chris Murphy, who talks about what you're seeing, because actually Trump has not appointed a Secretary of Education yet. He's working through his what's called DOGE, or Department of Government Efficiency. Yeah. Some call it Department of oligarchs and other things, right? There are other words. Right, yes. But this DOGE mechanism, which the legality of DOGE is something that's being challenged and sued for as well. But Senator Chris Murphy said, quote, that this is an attempt for the federal government, and it's the most serious constitutional crisis since Watergate. President Trump wants to, quote, decide where money is spent so that he can reward his political friends and punish his political enemies. Now, Linda McMahon was someone she was also the president of his President Trump's Political Action Committee, PAC. Yeah. So he's literally rewarding those who donated and supported his campaign. We know the overseer of DOGE, Elon Musk, President Musk. We know he donated over $100 million to the Trump campaign through his super PAC and different things. So you're literally seeing rewards for people who donated to his campaign, a pay-to-play thing happening where they're put in unqualified positions, and now they want to dismantle the institutions. And that Department of Education was one of the first ones in the crosshair of this administration.
Right. He's choosing people who are qualified for one thing and one thing only, to work in a corporate mindset. The government does not do well when those in power treat it like a corporation, because a corporation's number one, thought is profit.
Right.
Usually profit over people.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas the government should be prioritizing its people. And all the people he's putting in place are unqualified because they don't know how to prioritize people, only profit. So in putting these people in the office, it's easy to laugh and say, ugh, they're unqualified, this is a joke. But really, we should be scared because it's not a laughing matter. He's choosing people who are qualified to do one thing, and that is to dismantle the departments that they've been placed in. That is a corporate thing. There are folks who are hired by corporations to dismantle, different areas of their of the corporation, and so that's what we're seeing here. And the dismantling of the Department of Education says a lot because there are funds there to be used, but those funds are supposed to be for students.
Right.
And so we're once again crippling our students. We're crippling their future. We're taking away their future. And so it's easy to just go, oh my gosh, I can't believe he's trying to put, the former chair of the WWE into office. And it is funny, but it's also scary because she has a history of dismantling and disrupting, but disrupting in a way that is not to the benefit of anyone other than those in power.
Right. Coming from a professional sport that uses violence as entertainment. And hey, I grew up watching wrestling, so
did I. Yeah.
But does those skills qualify her to be the Secretary of Education? Absolutely not. So that shows that he's putting people in these positions to dismantle them. And education is one of the most important and really last remaining public goods and public services that this country really supports. And you see the federal government trying to undermine many public institutions or institutions that should serve the public, whether it's the healthcare industry, whether it's the post office service, right? The postal service. Just federal workers right now are in fear of losing their jobs and other things because of the attempt to really dismantle the government. And the Department of Education is one of the most important federal entities because there are over 50 million students in public schools in this country. And at the end of the day, the buck stops with the Department of Education to ensure that bullying and harassment doesn't exist, discrimination, segregation, other things that this country has a deep history of that you had to go to the Supreme Court to reverse. Even with special education, which we mentioned, $15 billion comes from the Department of Education. But special education itself was used to segregate students, to disproportionately place black students in special education and different things as a form to still have white students over here, black students over there. And there have been court cases challenging this and needed oversight to ensure that overrepresentation doesn't exist. But now there's going to be no oversight or limited oversight.
And I think when we talk about the Department of Education not having an influence on curriculum, we mean that directly. And we did touch on how it indirectly affects that. And I think people think a lot about the K through 12 level, but there's also going to be impacts on higher education.
Oh, yeah.
And so higher education tends to be the incubator for ethnic studies, for critical race theory. That's usually taught at that level. Public schools get their funding in part from the government. And so now you're going to see challenges from the government over ethnic studies and critical race theory. These are already buzzwords to those who don't like them. And so now we're seeing a bigger fight because now those programs may lose funding. You may see that there are not going to be scholarships available for those who are majoring, who are taking those classes. You might see someone get dinged for even taking those classes. We don't know what's going to happen to the educators. We may lose the resources. And so while they may not say that you can't teach this, removing the funding effectively does that.
Right. And you already see Doge creating what they call buzzwords to pull federal grants. If your grant mentions equity, inclusion, ethnic studies, like there was a one-page document of DOGE where they're pulling billions of dollars or trying to pull billions of dollars in funds that support institutions of higher education and other things. And the Department of Education does have a really important role in higher education. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah.
And related to Linda McMahon, she actually is a shareholder and profits off of student loans and has bonds with different universities and different things. And student loans is another really important, critical aspect of the Department of Education's responsibility. And there are tens of thousands of students, alumni with millions, well, actually billions in student debt. So sorry, billions.
I don't get my education without student loans.
Right.
I didn't come from money. I didn't have it. That student loan made it so that I could get my foot in the door with the people next to me who, you know, were lucky enough to have someone else pay for their education. And I don't knock them for that, but I'm glad that I was able to even sit next to them and get the same education. Without that student loan, I'm not in that classroom.
Right, exactly. A student loan is what allowed me to go to a law school that my grandfather literally couldn't attend. And the Department of Education's oversight is what forced this school, University of Miami, you know, to allow black students to participate and enroll. But yeah, access to education, you know, America being the
what
country it is, it makes education one of the most unaffordable things, and especially for our generation and this generation coming after us, you know, and future generations. It's looking like education, you know, it's you're normal. It's normalized to graduate college with six-figure debt or have a cloud over your head with debt that impacts your life trajectory even. And what the administration wants to do is in-debt students even more at the expense and in support of the banks. They want to support the corporations and others, the shareholders who profit off student loans. And they want students to be in debt. They want citizens to be in debt.
I can relate as someone with a student debt. So that's at the higher education level, and we touched on it briefly, but let's go back to a little bit. K through 12 schools. We're seeing that these executive orders are putting pressure on folks on the local level because they want to rescind funding for anybody that promotes gender ideology. And I'm quoting this now, discriminatory equity ideology. The fact that you could call equity discriminatory perhaps shows me that you are not as educated as I thought, but
it's like an oxymoron.
I digress. Discriminatory equity ideology. The idea is if you're teaching, and what's funny is those words put together don't make much sense to anyone. And because the government is not defining them, it means that they can say that anything falls into that category, which means they can rescind funding for almost anything. Maybe you're not teaching Black History Month, but maybe in an English class, you are assigned to read a book by a Black author. Someone might decide that that's, you know, discriminatory equity ideology. Or what if you have to read a book by an author who years later people found out was queer? That might be considered gender ideology. You know, so we're finding that because nothing's being defined very well by the federal government, that people are getting that inch and running a mile in terms of how they can discriminate and how they can sort of force schools to remove anything that the government might deem as, you know, a reason for them to not get funding. Yeah. And so, you know, and this directive aligns with sort of broader conservative efforts to challenge educational policies that have in the past really been expanded as of late, but now we're seeing them sort of get pushed back.
Even some of the basic things that the Biden administration put forward, a lot of that was rescinded. And you saw that Department of Education actually the week before publish the civil rights data, for example, because they knew this incoming administration would not want to publish this data. And as a researcher who works with that civil rights data, it shows a lot of disparities with Black students being like 3 times more likely to be arrested in schools, more likely to be suspended, LGBTQ students bullied at
Right.
rates that are alarming. And the data actually shows that our children are really being attacked in schools. The attacks that increase, unfortunately, with the election of someone like President Trump. I mean, we saw here where immediately after he was elected, there were rallies in schools where students were marching, carrying Trump and MAGA flags, going into teachers of color rooms and calling them derogatory names and different things like that. This is the type of behavior we see increase under this administration. And a responsive Department of Education would require the schools to do something to ensure that all students feel welcome. That's actually the requirement of schools. They have an obligation to ensure that bullying is addressed, and that students feel welcome and safe. One of my biggest, I don't want to say fear, but something that has me a bit worried is what the administration is calling patriotic education.
Right.
As we come up on this, I guess, 250-year anniversary of this American empire, they are attempting to roll out a whole project, which, Project 2025 talked about this in, I believe they're calling it the 1776 project and other things under the last administration. But you're seeing a grab of different institutions by President Trump, like the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts was just recently, Trump himself fired
all of them.
board members, including like John Baptiste, right? Accomplished black artist, to overtake this public institution for what he's deeming patriotic education, and that's indoctrination. So what story are they going to tell about America 250 years ago? Because again, I know what my ancestors were facing 250 years ago in this land. I know what the laws were and how, I mean, when the Constitution was passed, black people were 3/5 human beings, right? And even before that, the laws that made it illegal for black people to learn to read and marry each other and literally could not be citizens. So this is the patriotic era that they want to reflect on, and they dog whistle, saying that that's the type of power structure that they would like to return to in this country.
We're sort of seeing the undoing of our education. We're seeing the undoing of the structures in place that were supposed to back up our education in terms of cultural centers. And we're seeing that not only are they're not being removed, but they're being taken over, right? And so it feels, I think I saw someone say that there's been a hostile takeover of the American government from the inside. And that's what it kind of does feel like. And so in terms of education and, cultural significance of a lot of things that have been built to supplement education, I agree with you. It's worrisome that patriotic education is a phrase at all.
Right.
Because education, truly patriotic education, is inclusive of all history. And patriotic education means that you are choosing history.
Right. And I think they mean another P word. I think they mean patriarchal.
Patriarchal, sure, truly.
For example, President Musk has a huge issue what he calls, he has a trans daughter, transgender daughter, but he blames her becoming transgender on school and what he called the woke mind virus, the school put the woke mind virus on her. And this was a private school, wasn't even a public school. So you have this narrative and this fear that schools are indoctrinating folks, and this attempt to eliminate different stories in a more inclusive environment. And that's the era that we're entering or returning to, because I guess that's what they meant by Make America Great Again. Go back to the times where
people could cover their eyes and pretend that the bad never happened.
Exactly.
I think it's ironic that people are really putting the source of indoctrination in classrooms when we really don't even respect teachers enough to pay them a living wage, that we say that the indoctrination must be happening outside of the house versus in the home. I think it's ironic to say that people must be indoctrinated because there's no way anybody with free will, anybody with access to education, anybody with access to a diverse plethora of options for learning about themselves and others would somehow, as if that the existence of all that is indoctrination, as opposed to the removal of all that is indoctrination.
Right.
It's very ironic that indoctrination has to come at the cost of those in power saying exactly what needs to be taught and exactly what does not need to be taught. Right. Because if I were to ask someone, which looks more like indoctrination, I have the sense they would say that the dismantling of the Department of Education right now looks a little bit more like indoctrination than a student simply being exposed to the world outside their home by going to school and being surrounded by people who are diverse, by an education that is beyond, the four walls of their home.
You see that. It's like the government is deliberately trying to turn the lights out or make it more difficult to access basic information, making our history contraband. Like I think of the book from Kaepernick Publishing. Our history has always been contraband with Robin D.G. Kelly, right?
Yeah.
Now in this era, you see that even more where just basic knowledge, the Department of Education itself may no longer exist, and basic knowledge is being targeted, basic truths.
But as always, and I have always had great faith in students and the youth because, students could be of any age, but especially right now, I have a lot of faith in students because what the past couple of years have taught me from the last Trump administration to now leading up to this administration is that students are willing to fight for their education and for the education of those that come after them. As usual, they left the students out of the conversation, but the students are going to make themselves a part of the conversation. Sure. And it's beautiful to see, and I hope that we could all find ways to support them.
Absolutely. I mean, literally right now as we speak, thousands of students, if not tens of thousands of students are walking out in Los Angeles to protest the federal policies and different things. And students will always fight the power.
Right. Students have always in their own way led a lot of these movements for civil rights, for equality, for diversity, for inclusion. And so I'm excited to see that that's not a tradition that will be lost. And no matter what happens, no matter what the curriculum becomes, no matter if we have a Department of Education or not, hopefully we do, that the students are going to find a way to teach themselves and to organize themselves and to make sure that their voices are heard.
Thank you for watching and listening to the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Please follow us on social media platforms at Your Rights Camp and follow us on YouTube at Know Your Rights Camp.